Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We are following breaking news tonight. The House vote to formalize the impeachment inquiry into President Biden. It has passed. Lawmakers voted along party lines. Investigation is focused on the Biden family's business dealings over the years, especially that of the president's son, Hunter Biden. So far, investigators have yet to uncover any credible evidence of criminal wrongdoing by President Biden. Catherine Herridge and Nicole Killian join us now. Catherine is a CBS News senior investigative correspondent, and Nicole Killian is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Nicole, we'll begin with you. You're up on the Hill outside the House. Along party lines, not a surprise. Where does it all go from here?
Yeah, well, I will say one thing that was a surprise is that there was a one-member, Colorado's Ken Buck, who had just yesterday told us that he was leaning no, but he ultimately, in the end, decided to support this impeachment inquiry. So that is, to a certain extent, what enabled this to pass strictly along party lines. Republicans sticking with Republicans, Democrats sticking with Democrats. We saw Leader Jeffries come out ahead of this vote, strongly urging a no vote. And obviously, many Democrats spent the better part of this afternoon on the floor, really chiding and derailing this impeachment inquiry, saying that it doesn't have enough evidence. It doesn't merit investigation. They don't even know what Republicans are trying to investigate here. Republicans, for their part, argue they are simply following the playbook of Democrats when they launched an impeachment inquiry into then President Trump back in 2019 over that phone call he had with Ukraine's president. But look, this is a very polarizing vote, very divisive vote, and one that is likely to have implications as we head into a presidential campaign year next year.
Catherine, Nicole just used the word implications for the campaign year. What are the implications in your view?
I think some of the greatest implications actually may ripple effect from these criminal prosecutions. I think especially in California. Last week, the grand jury there unsealed a 9-count indictment against Hunter Biden. But if you look very closely at the language, I think they're signaling in that indictment that they're looking very hard at FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They call Hunter Biden a lobbyist. They detail his business dealings with Burisma, the Ukraine energy firm CEFC, the Chinese firm Romania, and others. And I think some of the greatest jeopardy comes that if there is a superseding indictment in California on FARA and other members of the Biden family are implicated in that.
Nicole, how are House Republicans going to deal with the ongoing federal investigations, even as they investigate on their own?
Well, that remains to be seen. But as I mentioned, I think if anything, it is continuing to watch the political fallout here, if there is any to be had. I did speak a short time ago with New York Congressman D'Esposito, who is from a swing district, one of those New York Republicans who helped Republicans win the majority. And I asked him whether or not this may hurt him in his own district. Take a listen.
I trust in the leadership of the committees that they wouldn't be taking the next steps if they didn't feel that there was something necessary.
But being in the kind of district you're not concerned that you could get some blowback from your constituents over this?
The vote today is going to make Biden supporters unhappy, and it's going to make others happy. I mean, that you're not going to please everyone. I think what this comes down to is doing what we're supposed to do based on the oath that we took. It's not about partisan politics.
And so that really is a line that we have heard from a number of both moderate Republicans, but more conservative Republicans as well, that they do think, given all the work that's been put into this impeachment inquiry, that it merits more investigation. Of course, we heard from Hunter Biden himself directly this morning, who really tried to pour cold water on this inquiry, saying that his father had no financial involvement in his business dealings, calling this entire impeachment inquiry a sham.
We heard from Nicole, from our top political strategists here, Joel Payne and Maura Gillespie, about Speaker Mike Johnson, who's new in the job. What are you hearing in your reporting, Nicole, about how Speaker Johnson is talking to his members about his strategy here, how he's going to handle the political fallout? This is a test for him, not just this vote. He got every Republican to come along, as you just detailed. But what about the next step? And what are you learning about Johnson as you report this out?
Well, I did have a chance to very briefly ask him ahead of this vote if he intended to move forward with it, despite Hunter Biden's claims that, again, his father, the president, had nothing to do with his business dealings. And he said that this was an investigation and an inquiry that was called for, that is merited in his view. And he told me even before this vote that he was confident he would have the vote. So I think, obviously we are still kind of watching how the speaker kind of navigates some of these key votes. On some, he has been successful, others he has not. But on this one, he did hit the jackpot in terms of believing that he had the votes. And in the end, Republicans delivered. We did not see any defections, which is significant. Although, again, as I mentioned, it certainly makes for a polarizing environment going forward.
Catherine, when you step back and look at this, if a person who's just tuning into the Biden investigation on Capitol Hill looks at this and says, okay, Hunter Biden is a private citizen and he had foreign business dealings, they might ask themselves, hey, many members of Congress have spouses or children who have private businesses. I remember years ago I was covering, for example, Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas at the time, a Republican, and his wife was a real estate agent in Alexandria. No one was investigating the fact that his spouse was a real estate agent in Alexandria, Virginia. So the law, Congress usually are pretty fine with sons and daughters, spouses having their own business, sometimes being a lobbyist. We've heard a lot of members of Congress have sons or daughters who are lobbyists. So private business has always been, maybe it makes many uncomfortable for obvious reasons, it's always been a part of the political world. What is breaking through here that's raising a red flag with congressional Republicans that makes this different than that kind of usual run-of-the-mill context with maybe unseemly but not illegal private business around Congress or around a vice president or president?
I guess I would summarize it with a couple of points. I think first, they've been able to obtain these banking records now independently. This is data that's come separately from the data on Hunter Biden's laptop. And they're making the argument, who needs 20 shell companies to move around more than $24 million, right? That's kind of point number one. They're trying to connect the dots there, if there are dots to be connected. There's been sort of a shifting explanation as to President Biden's knowledge or awareness, right? Originally, it was like there was a wall. He's like not involved at all. Now we have language which is he wasn't financially involved. So they're kind of the parsing of the words that I think are worthy of further investigation. And then finally, at its most basic level, Hunter Biden was subpoenaed to appear. Any private citizen that is subpoenaed has an obligation to appear. And he's arguing, I don't want to have a closed-door deposition. I want to be able to speak publicly. But that's not the investigative strategy that was even taken by the January 6th committee. They did depositions first, and then they did public testimony to follow. So I think there is a pretty persuasive argument that he's asking for different treatment because he's a different kind of witness. And Republicans said, no, we're going to treat you like any other witness in this case.
And just quickly, Catherine, is there any expectation that President Biden could be called as a witness by House Republicans?
I don't know.
I know you're trying to get that scoop if it's going to happen. But
I will try my best to get it. I just think the real jeopardy, Bob, here is in this intersection between these criminal prosecutions and what they're investigating
do they
on
want
Capitol
to do?
Hill.
Do your sources close to these House Republicans
I think they
want
to get as close to President Biden as they can. Congressman Comer says this is an investigation of Joe Biden. He doesn't say it's an investigation of Hunter Biden. But from covering the courts, once something lands in the courts, it can be very unpredictable, the direction that it takes. And I think that's kind of the wild card here. What starts to come out in the tax case, whether there's intersection with Capitol Hill and Republicans can seek to exploit that, or it actually sort of diminishes their argument about involvement by the president.
The DOJ, you really never know what the Justice Department is up to with their investigations because they're certainly not as public as Congress. Catherine Herridge and Nicole Killian, thank you very much for swinging by. The Democrats are unified in the support of President Biden, despite this Republican-led investigation. Coming up next, my conversation with New York Democrat Congressman Dan Goldman. You're streaming America Decides. Prior to today's vote, I spoke with Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman of New York about the House Republican impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Here's our conversation. Joining us now from Capitol Hill is New York Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman. Congressman, thanks for taking the time. What do you make of the House Republicans moving pretty quickly on this inquiry, and as Scott just reported, moving maybe quickly to articles of impeachment? What does that say about the House Republicans, and what's the Democrats' response?
That the House Republicans are essentially an arm of Donald Trump's election campaign. They are doing this based on complete fiction. There are no facts to support any allegations of wrongdoing by President Biden, any connections to anything related to Hunter Biden. And they have done this investigation, Bob, for 12 months already. They have gathered well over 100,000 documents. They have interviewed and under oath 16 witnesses, including 10 government witnesses provided by the Biden administration. And yet they found no evidence to connect Joe Biden to wrongdoing. The best they can come up with is this bogus Burisma allegation that was debunked in the first impeachment in 2019, has been debunked ever since, and that was a scenario that actually hurt Hunter Biden's business interests by Joe Biden taking action. So there's nothing here, and it's just a political charade.
Congressman, you've been critical of some Republicans not showing up for their congressional depositions or hearings. Do you support Hunter Biden's position that he's not going to sit for a deposition with these House Republicans?
I do, and I do based on the fact that the House Republicans have released only 2 transcripts of dozens of transcribed interviews they have done as part of this investigation. And that the reason for that is that they continue to mischaracterize what goes on in those depositions. I have sat in them, and I have seen what they've said. I have then been bewildered by their gaslighting and misrepresentations, and there's no question that Hunter Biden sees that too, especially in the deposition of Devin Archer. Hunter Biden was here today ready to testify to the American people in an open and transparent way under oath and to answer any questions the Republicans had. They refused to accept his testimony, and yet we are about to go on the House floor and vote on an impeachment inquiry that they say they need because they need more evidence. The irony of rejecting evidence this morning and voting because you need more evidence this afternoon should not be lost on anyone.
You say the Republicans are moving in a direction that's not supported by the American people, that's not supported by evidence, but what are Democrats going to do politically in Congress to help President Biden? Because regardless of your complaints about this process, it's moving forward, and it could be catching the attention of millions of Americans who might not be paying that close of attention to all of this.
Yeah, I hope they do pay attention. I hope more and more Americans pay attention to this sham impeachment investigation, which Republicans have admitted is done only at the behest of Donald Trump and only to assist Donald Trump's campaign. Americans should be watching that the Republicans are focusing on this bogus impeachment investigation rather than on any meaningful legislation that would actually help the American people. They have done nothing in 12 months to help American people lower prices, find housing, curb gun violence, deal with the climate crisis, you name it. They have done nothing. And to distract from their ineptitude and incompetence, they are now moving forward with a bogus impeachment inquiry, and I am confident that the American people will see right through it, just like the voters in the 18 Biden districts see right through it, according to polling earlier this week, which is very unequivocal that they do not want the Republicans to go forward with this. So I hope this becomes an election year issue.
Speaking of legislation, where do things stand in terms of a possible deal with the Republicans on some kind of border legislation that's coupled with funding for Ukraine? Is that ever going to happen, or are they going to need to be standalone at the end of the day?
I certainly hope it happens. It is truly remarkable that the Republican Party, the party of Ronald Reagan, would be abdicating the United States' role as the beacon of democracy around the world and would withdraw support for Ukraine, a democracy, a fledgling democracy, fighting an illegal invasion by a Russian dictator who has made it clear he will continue to pursue illegal invasions in other democratic states. And that to imagine that they would try to extort the Democratic Party by including extreme border policy changes in order to get any funding for Ukraine and to support democracy around the world is startling. It is baffling to me. Ukraine is running out of money. By the end of this month, they will be in big trouble. And if we do not pass legislation to help Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will win. And that will hang over every single Republican for the rest of time.
And where do you believe House Democrats want to go on the border? It's a contentious issue across party lines and within the party.
Absolutely. And I think there are many who understand and who believe, including myself, that the situation at the border is untenable and we need to fix it. The problem is the way the Republicans want to fix it is not only xenophobic and anti-immigrant, it's also ineffective. And so it is both extreme and useless to actually deal with the issues that are happening at the border. But we want to fix it. We would like to get in a room with meaningful bipartisan conversations, good faith negotiations to come up with proper, effective, result-oriented solutions. But the Republicans are not interested in actual effective solutions. They are just interested in their extreme agenda to eliminate immigration, to keep foreigners out of this country. And this is a country that is built on immigrants. We need more immigration for our economy and to fill jobs that are open around the country. And we should be welcoming immigrants in an orderly process, not trying to keep them out.
Congressman Dan Goldman of New York, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
President Biden met with families of Americans taken hostage by Hamas. Speaking outside the White House, they expressed confidence the Biden administration is doing everything it can to bring their loved ones home. This was the president's first time meeting with them in person. CBS News' senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us. Ed, thank you. Tell us more, Ed, about the president's meeting with the families.
As you said, Bob, first time he's met with them in person. He had spoken with a handful about 2 months ago via Zoom in what was described by those involved as an incredibly emotional exchange. Today, the meeting stretched in part because he gave them a tour of the Oval Office and part of the West Wing, which is something he's now doing on a regular basis when he has these kinds of guests come by. But really wanted to drive home the point, it seems, that this remains a top priority for him, for his administration, and send a signal to Israel and Hamas that the fate of Americans especially, but all hostages generally, remains a top concern of the president. It's part of why he continues pushing for longer pauses and assurances from Hamas that they are willing, able, and ready to release those hostages as they had promised to do. Remember, they've been holding back some that were part of the original agreement. And, you know, what was also telling is even the White House and these families can't entirely say, at least publicly, what the condition of the remaining Americans who are unaccounted for is. That's often a tactic done to ensure their safety, but it may also be because it's still very difficult to know exactly where they are and in what condition they're in.
Ed, the president often has empathy for those who are going through tough times in life. That's been a hallmark of his political career and really his life, not just on politics, but personally. Did you see any signs today of the president having a moving discussion or conversation with these families?
They wouldn't get into much of what he told them, but they did make clear they have no better friend in Washington than him when it comes to this issue and making sure that their family members are released. And to your point, aides have said that in the original meeting they had back in October, the president listened for quite some time, grew emotional when one of them learned during the meeting, in fact, that one of their relatives had been killed, recounted the story of his wife and daughter who were killed in the 1970s at the beginning of his Senate career. And so, yes, this meeting consistent with something that he does on a fairly regular basis in talking to people who are facing tough times. It's part of the reason they say he wanted to make sure he was in touch with these families. But we should point out, Bob, There are dozens of other Americans being held against their will or wrongfully detained, as the U.S. would classify them, around the world in places like Afghanistan, China, Venezuela, Iran, Syria. The president has never spoken to or engaged in any way with those families, something that advocates for them today pointed out.
Well, Ed, just quickly on that, why would he meet with some hostage families and not with the other? What's the real story?
It's a question
there?
we've been asking. Yeah, it's a question we've been asking. Our Margaret Brennan has been asking on Face the Nation of foreign policy, national security officials when they appear. In this case, it's because it's designed to put pressure on Israel and Hamas to either come up with another ceasefire to get them released and to reiterate to them how seriously he takes getting those Americans released, but also because so much of the world is focused on this. And there are so many other countries, Thailand, Russia, Germany, for example, that have people being wrongfully detained or that were. So he understands there's more of a global focus. Those other cases have the potential to draw too much attention to those countries or to the situations, and those countries involved may want to try to extract something from the United States that the Biden administration, at least, isn't willing to give away.
I'm sure those families will keep asking for those meetings with the president. Ed, before we move on, let's listen to what Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, had to say today about Hunter Biden.
Amid everything else today, did he spend any time watching what his son had to say outside the Capitol?
So just a couple of things on that, and I want to be really clear. Look, as you know, Hunter Biden is a private citizen, and so I certainly would refer you to his representatives. Look, the president was certainly familiar with what his son was going to say.
I love it, Ed. You asking the question, and then you here on America Decides. Lucky us. So you were in the White House briefing room today. You asked the question about the president's knowledge of his son and what he would say outside of the U.S. Senate. Take us behind the scenes at the White House as they deal with the private citizen, Hunter Biden, but the political overtones and of almost everything that was unfolding today.
This is one of those things that make you go, moments, Bob, because normally when it comes to Hunter Biden, Karine and other officials have been tight-lipped and refused to say anything at all about what the president knows, whether he's been talking to his son about it, other than to say, of course, that he loves his son, he supports him, and he stands by him. But to say that the president was familiar with what Hunter was planning to do today, to go to Capitol Hill and so publicly and defiantly defy a congressional subpoena, something the president has said in the past about certain people should lead to some kind of punishment, if not prosecution, is notable, because now it's going to create a slippery slope of other queries by congressional Republicans. Well, what else has the president known about Hunter Biden's decision to either defy Congress or potentially face prosecution from the Justice Department? How actively is he potentially advising his son on all of this? And what kind of an effect does that have on his presidency? Which was also notable then to see Karine point out that despite the deep personal problems and anguish the president has over this, because remember, this is rooted in his son's addiction issues, he remains focused on the American people's concerns. The meeting with Zelensky yesterday, the meeting with the hostage families today, a meeting he had with his infrastructure council. The idea being he can be a father worried about his son, but he will still be president focused on big issues. Either way, by suggesting that they knew anything, which one would expect, but that they just haven't commented on before, it was notable, and it's probably going to lead to a little more questioning of the White House, not only by reporters, but by Congress.
And you'll be there asking the questions. Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much for stopping by. We appreciate it. The Supreme Court announced it's taking up two major cases, one on access to abortion medication and the other about January 6th. The justices will consider the Biden administration's bid to maintain access to the drug mifepristone. This marks the first dispute the High Court will hear involving abortion since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. The court will also decide whether January 6 defendants can be charged with obstructing an official proceeding, which is one of the four charges against former President Trump in the upcoming 2020 election case and trial. And coming up next, we discuss the impeachment inquiry with our powerhouse political panel. You're streaming America Decides. Thank you for being with us. We are still following the breaking news on Capitol Hill tonight. The White House is watching as the House Republicans formalize their impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Joel Payne and Maura Gillespie are back with us here at the America Decides table. Joel is a CBS News political contributor, Democratic strategist, and chief communications officer for Move On. Maura previously served as an advisor to Speaker John Boehner and Congressman Adam Kinzinger. She is now the founder of Blue Stack Strategies, two top strategists here at the table. So we just got in a statement from the White House. President Biden said that this move by House Republicans, a baseless stunt. Joel, as the Democrat here at the table, the president's clearly pushing back, but he's not getting in front of a camera. He's issuing a statement.
Yeah, and the framing, I think, of the president's statement is something that jumped out to me. Talked about all the things that are on the agenda, the national agenda, whether it's Ukraine, Israel, talked about wanting to secure the border and frame that up against Republicans focusing on what he calls a baseless impeachment ploy. And I think you're going to hear that a lot from Democrats. I was actually talking to someone close to the White House related to the president's statement, and they also pointed out to me they really see this as an extension of Republicans doing Trump's bidding. You know, almost them acting as a surrogate for the Trump campaign. You could see Mike Johnson, folks like Troy Niels, who admitted earlier today that this is about Trump 2024. That's very much on the mind of the folks at the White House right now.
Maura, you've been an eyewitness to history. You've had an up-close, really up-front, first-row view of the Republican Party's evolution over the last decade. When you think about what you've seen, where does this fit into the larger Republican story we've all been following, whether it's inside or outside the GOP?
You know, we thought we had it bad, 2013, 2014.
With the government shutdown.
Right, and what we saw as the rabble-rousers and those who were trying to be obstructionists and move the goalpost on John Boehner and leadership then. But that was nothing compared to what, the conference has become, unfortunately. And again, I think with messaging, especially on this topic, you're going to have so many issues with people like Neil saying those things and putting that out there as it is a 2024 for Trump and that they're doing Trump's bidding. And the Republicans who voted, again, all of them voted for it. And so some of these members who did it for the reasons that I think a majority of them did it was because they felt like it was important to get the information that comes from an impeachment inquiry. They're going to really have to message that against members of their own caucus who are saying Trump 2024. Like, that's not helpful to them. It's not a helpful message.
What we're not seeing tonight, at least for now, is Speaker Mike Johnson. I mean, he's not Newt. He's not even really Speaker John Boehner in the sense of a public presence who's saying, I'm the standard bearer for this impeachment inquiry. This seems to be much more of a bottom-up effort from rank-and-file members rather than a top-down effort by the speaker as he battles the president.
Well, look, I think that's probably a tactic. As a strategy, I think he wants to demonstrate this is not leadership enforcing a vote upon their members. I think he wants to demonstrate, hey, we were compelled to do this because of all the questions about Joe Biden. So I think probably what you're seeing is a little bit of a strategy from Mike Johnson. And look, this will win him points. This will raise money. This will certainly spike energy within the Republican caucus in the House, but also with Republicans around the country who are looking for something to rally behind. I just don't think it's the type of strategy that's additive. It's not an addition strategy. It's not a strategy that's going to grow the coalition of Republicans. It's not going to make it easier for Republicans to hold the House in 2024.
But what about the White House? When you look at the presidential race, the big news this week, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, through his support behind former Ambassador Nikki Haley, you have a presidential race that's playing out at the same time this is playing out on Capitol Hill. But you don't hear Ambassador Haley or former Governor Christie or Governor DeSantis talking about this issue with the same kind of visceral energy that you hear at least from House Republicans today. Do you see a disconnect between the reality politically of the presidential race and the primary and what's going on in Congress or not?
It's not helpful to those candidates to be talking about what's happening on the Hill because House Republicans have created a terrible narrative for themselves by having the speaker fight last as long as it did. And they're trying to crawl back from being the chaos caucus of what's happened. And to Joel's point earlier, not getting enough things done this cycle, this Congress, this session. So I wouldn't, if I were a candidate or if I were advising a candidate, I would not want to touch the House Republican or even just Congress in general with a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't even want to talk about this topic because it's not helpful to them or their campaigns. But they can be talking about what Joe Biden has or hasn't done. They can be talking about where he has failed to get things across the finish line for the American people. That's fine, but they shouldn't really be touching on Congress.
Group of folks who I'll be very curious to hear from, Senate Republicans. Now, Senate Republicans have taken a little bit of a harder line on the Ukraine issue related to the border spending, but are you going to hear from, let's say, a Josh Hawley, who's up for re-election in 2024?
He just endorsed Trump.
Who just endorsed Trump. Are you going to hear from a Ted Cruz? Are you going to hear from a Rick Scott? The Republicans who you would think of who would naturally be aligned with Donald Trump, but who maybe it doesn't help them politically to be seen as kind of a part of this larger effort to impeach Joe Biden. Are they going to be outspoken? And is the broader Senate Republican caucus, is Mitch McConnell and those folks, the John Thunes of the world, are they going to be outspoken as well?
Earlier in the broadcast, Scott McFarland, our correspondent on Capitol Hill, said he was speaking to Congressman Burchett, a Republican who doesn't believe that the Senate Republicans would do anything to impeach President Biden down the line. But it's a tricky thing to predict because you don't know how exactly it's going to unfold. Not to ask you to make a prediction, but how do you see the dynamics, at least more in terms of if this actually gets out of the House, impeachment articles are passed by House Republicans by a narrow margin in the House. What happens in the Senate? What are the dynamics there?
Again, there's a lot that needs to be uncovered. But I will say that the struggle to impeach even President Donald Trump should show us that this is a very serious step to be taking, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. And I think that all of those members need to think about where they are in their reelection cycle, especially for the Senate, because that's going to be a factor. But also how they want history to remember them. Do they have enough information to go ahead and make this vote? It's historic. It's hugely important. So they shouldn't be taking it lightly. And again, not only just for their constituents and for who they represent, but for themselves and what legacy they want to leave behind. Is this the right vote? Really needs to be a conscious and thought out and thoughtful, vote.
We're going to have to leave it there. Joel Payne, Maura Gillespie, thanks so much for staying around all night. I promise we're going to let you go home. You're not going to have to sleep here overnight at America Decides, but come back soon. We appreciate it. And the judge overseeing Donald Trump's federal election interference case has paused all trial deadlines. This comes as the former president pursues an appeal over whether he has immunity from criminal prosecution due to his time in office. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has granted special counsel Jack Smith's request to speed up the consideration of Trump's motion. And the Biden administration says it's willing to back a sweeping new immigration policy if congressional Republicans agree to supporting more funding for Ukraine. We'll have more on the negotiations, which are ongoing, coming up. You're streaming America Decides. The White House has indicated to Congress that it's open to a new border policy similar to Title 42. The policy now under consideration would allow the U.S. to expel migrants without asylum screenings. It would also expand the number of migrant detentions and deportations. CBS News immigration reporter Camila Montoya Galvez joins us now. We really appreciate your reporting on all of these immigration issues. Take us inside the White House's perspective on the ongoing immigration discussions. What are they considering when it comes to migrant rights, Democratic pushback, and also Republican demands as they seek this broader deal on Ukraine funding?
Well, Bob, we have learned here at CBS News that the White House is considering some pretty sweeping and drastic limits on asylum eligibility and also new authorities to increase deportations and the number of migrants who can be detained here in the U.S. while their cases are adjudicated by U.S. courts. One of the proposals is a reinstatement of a Title 42-like policy that would allow border agents to summarily expel migrants to Mexico or to their home countries without processing their claims. It would not be tied, however, to a public health emergency like Title 42 was. Instead, it would be tied to the daily number of illegal border crossings. So whenever there is a certain number of crossings, that authority would be triggered.
Let's pause there for a second and dig into this.
Yeah.
When a migrants' rights advocate hears that Title 42-like policy, what's their reaction? And when a Republican who is calling for stricter border policy hears Title 42-like on all these fronts, what do they hear? Because it seems to be probably a different thing to a different block.
From the progressive perspective, Bob, this is a return to a draconian Trump-era policy. This was an order enacted by the CDC at the outset of the pandemic during the Trump administration that used COVID as a pretext to expel migrants, and it suspended asylum law effectively. It denied migrants the legal right that they have under domestic and refugee law internationally to request asylum if they're physically here on U.S. soil. That's the concern from Democratic lawmakers who are more progressive and Latino lawmakers in the House and in the Senate who are pushing the White House to refrain from agreeing to this. From the Republican perspective, they believe this is a critical tool to manage the unprecedented flows of migration that we're seeing along the border. Border Patrol recorded over 2 million migrant apprehensions the past fiscal year. That's only the second time in U.S. history that has happened. And they believe they need this authority because the U.S. right now does not have the personnel or the resources to screen everyone for asylum. So they're basically arguing that the stadium is full, Bob, and that they cannot screen more people when there's a certain threshold met in terms of illegal crossings.
Do you believe it would be enough for Republicans to come along and cut a deal with the White House on immigration and Ukraine?
It could very well be enough for Senate Republicans who have been pushing for a compromise because these are all policies that they have demanded. However, the open question, Bob, is whether House Republicans will view this as sufficiently strict to deal with the situation at the border because earlier this year, they passed an immigration bill known as H.R. 2 that was much more sweeping in nature. It would, for example, mandate the detention of migrant families traveling with children, return the U.S. to the Remain in Mexico policy, and severely restrict, importantly, the parole authority, which is this law that the administration has been using to resettle hundreds of thousands of migrants from Afghanistan, Ukraine, and other parts of the world.
You've sketched out the contours of a possible deal with the senators, both Democrats and Republicans, and the Biden administration. You've also mentioned H.R. 2, the Republican proposal in the House. Is there anything in the House Republican H.R. 2 border proposal that would be acceptable to the Senate working group and the White House?
Well, all these items that I mentioned initially during the first part of our segment are in H.R. 2, a Title 42
so some
authority.
of it's at least being included.
Yes. The White House, remarkably, in my opinion, is accepting much of H.R. 2 right now.
Are Democrats going to revolt if H.R. 2 is being included?
Many of them will revolt. You're seeing a lot of progressives come out against this proposal by the White House. However, the White House is betting on their argument winning out. And that argument is that if they don't enact significant restrictions on asylum and the border policy, Trump may win in 2024, and he would enact even more draconian measures.
If President Biden is not directly involved, who's the key person to watch quickly on the Biden side in terms of negotiating on immigration? Who's the person who does the negotiation?
The chief of staff and obviously the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, who was just on Capitol Hill yesterday.
Camilo Montoya Galvez, thank you so much for your reporting. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking for Republican presidential candidates in Iowa, those trying to run against Trump. We take you to the Hawkeye State to hear where some of those voters stand on the race. You're streaming America Decides.
Tonight is a victory for courageous conservatives across Iowa and all across this great nation.
You have taken the first step of taking back this country.
Tonight, it starts here in Iowa, but it doesn't end here.
Welcome back to America Decides. A lot of history there, recent political history in Iowa. Some of the recent Iowa caucus winners, Republicans who all failed to secure the party's nomination. And with just 33 days now until the state picks their candidates in the caucuses, former President Donald Trump does hold the commanding lead. A new poll has him at 51% in Iowa. Tonight, he is holding an event with voters in Coralville. CBS News campaign reporters Olivia Rinaldi and Torian Small joined us now from Iowa. I'm sure you're both pretty chilly. Well, maybe Olivia's inside, a little less chilly, but still cold outside in Iowa. We appreciate you braving the elements, braving the crowds. Torian, we'll begin with you. You've been speaking to some voters. I always love to hear from voters. Tell us what they have to say.
Yeah, what's interesting that Olivia's at that Trump event because all the candidates not named Trump has been reading the writings on the wall and realized they have to court in some way or another those Trump supporters because they make up a large part of this Iowa caucus base. Now, I talked to a few voters who said Vivek Ramaswamy could potentially be their guy. Some just not convinced that now is the time for him. Take a listen to what they had to say.
I'm hoping Vivek will stay toward 28 because he would be my second choice. I would vote for Trump again simply because of his policies.
Right now, I am leaning towards Trump, but I came here today and, just to kind of hear a message, but I am very open-minded.
Yeah, diverse group of voters there, all different age ranges. And really, they say that Trump is still, like you said, has a commanding lead in this race, partially because of his name recognition, his policies, and they just don't like the options left in this race.
All eyes are on Iowa, especially now after the New Hampshire governor, Chris Sununu, endorsed former Ambassador Nikki Haley yesterday, giving her a jolt in the Granite State. That puts a lot of pressure on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to do well in Iowa, try to, if not win, at least come in a strong second. Let's hear what he had to say about that endorsement from Governor Sununu.
Well, unlike some people running, if someone doesn't endorse me, I'm not going to go trash them. Chris is a good guy. He's done a good job. And I'm going to continue to say he's good. He's a really good campaigner. I mean, excellent campaigner. So in that sense, I think it's a benefit for her. But here's the problem. Even a campaigner as good as Chris is not going to be able to paper over Nikki being an establishment candidate.
Olivia, you just heard Governor DeSantis there. He is putting many chips on Iowa as he tries to stay in this race to compete with former President Trump. But clearly the Trump campaign's not ignoring Iowa. Tell us what they're doing on the ground with the candidate and with the campaign as DeSantis really tries to make his mark in that state.
Right, we're here today in Coralville, Iowa, for this Commit to Caucus event that Donald Trump is holding in the state. It's just his fourth event in Iowa in the last 6 weeks. However, I spoke with some campaign officials who told me that their strategy is to move in silence. Even though he's been here only a handful of times, they still feel very confident. They have about 50,000 Commit to Caucus cards here of people who came by and already said that they like him and they're going to show up for Donald Trump on Election Day. Of course, that's a little bit more than what DeSantis has currently in his Commit to Caucus cards, in his level. However, here, Trump feels very comfortable. As you mentioned that Des Moines Register poll, he's at 51%. That's historic levels. There's no Republican candidate or candidate ever, really, who has gotten that amount of support this close to the Iowa caucuses. It's extremely notable. The other notable part of that, though, is that he's turning out new voters. That's what's interesting. Donald Trump is getting first-time likely caucus goers in droves coming out here, Bob.
Olivia, you're standing there at a Trump event. I'm not there on the ground. I'm here in Washington. So tell me about the room. Who are the voters? What are they like? What's the atmosphere there? What does it tell you about the Trump campaign at this moment in Iowa?
Yeah, I will say people have been lining up all day to come to this event. The crowds outside were excited. They were doing their tailgating as they normally do here and having, their trailers, selling T-shirts, having grills out, cooking, enjoying the 36-degree weather that's here. I've seen a few QAnon shirts here in the crowd today, but these people are enthusiastic. They're so excited to turn out for Donald Trump yet again on January 15th. It's just 33 days away. They are excited. They're here for him, and he comes here, and he feels that energy. It's palpable. He feels the people in the room yelling, screaming for him, especially when he talks about his trials. That is something that has garnered a lot of support for him here in the state and across the country.
Torian, in about a minute, what's the concern about Trump among those voters who are not inclined toward him this time, like those voters you spoke to about Vivek Ramaswamy?
Yeah, some voters are concerned by his legal challenges. They believe that he probably won't be able to stay in the race if they do proceed. Others are concerned about his age. Some of the same criticism that we hear about Joe Biden, those same voters tell me that they have the same concerns for Donald Trump, which is why they are looking for a young Republican to potentially lead the party. But still, that consensus around whether or not someone should replace Donald Trump as the party's nominee isn't quite there yet, especially considering he's still leading far ahead in the lead in the polls.
We'll see if anything changes in the coming weeks. Olivia Rinaldi and Torian Small, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, more news. You're streaming CBS News.